Today, as we continue the Easter season, I want to begin a new homily series, something that I do on occasion. It's been a little while since I've had one, though. As hopefully you recall, the bishops here in the United States are calling us to a national Eucharistic revival to grow our love and appreciation for the Eucharist. And so following this call and having celebrated the beautiful celebrations of Easter, hopefully still upon our minds and hearts, I want to spend the next several weeks reflecting on and renewing our understanding of how to pray and participate in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The Church says that with regard to the Mass, we are called to full, active, and conscious participation. So what does that mean? Well, full participation, to put our whole selves into it. Sometimes people will say, I don't get anything out of Mass. Well, how much do you put into it? If we're not giving God anything, then why do we expect just to get it from Him when we're not giving ourselves? It's also supposed to be an active participation. Our part in the Mass isn't just passive. If somebody thinks that all they have to do is just sit in the pew and let it happen, they're missing a whole lot of what's going on. Our participation is also conscious, I suppose, as opposed to unconscious, right? Those who might be sleeping during Mass. No. Conscious participation means that we're aware of what we're doing. We realize what's going on, that we're truly participating. We know what to do during each part of the Mass, both externally through our bodies and our voices, but also internally with what's going on within our hearts and minds. And the Church says in order for us to deliberately choose to engage in this full, active, and conscious participation at Mass, we need to know how to do it. So in other words, we need to be instructed. We need to be taught. We need to learn. And even if you've been attending Mass for your entire life, there's always more that we can learn. Those who attended our Lenten mission found that that's precisely what happened. There was much that we learned from Father Cook's talks those evenings. For myself, it's been the same way. Even after having grown up, going to Mass every single weekend, going up to Catholic grade school, when I went to the seminary, my eyes were really opened to a greater fullness of how to pray the Mass. And last summer, in June of 2022, Pope Francis, he sent out an apostolic letter specifically on this topic called Desiderio Desiderave, on the liturgical formation of the people of God. And he stresses in there the importance of the formation in the liturgy for everybody, both priests and you as faithful people. So, we need to begin by asking ourselves, what is liturgy? What is that? It's a term we don't use outside of our Catholic language, but in the ancient world, in the Greek language, it originally simply meant a public work that somebody did on behalf of somebody else. That's what liturgy is. So Catholic liturgy is a public work that's done on behalf or in service of another person. So we need to ask, what service is being done? Who is doing the service, and who is the service being done for? Well, first off, liturgy is the work or service done primarily by God. God is the first one who does liturgy. It's connected really to God's greatest work, the work that we just celebrated at Easter. The work of Jesus Christ, who offered his life on our behalf through his passion, his death, his resurrection for our salvation. That's really the source of what liturgy is all about. That's God's great work. But liturgy is also our own participation in God's work. So we could say that liturgy is the participation of the people of God in the work of God. And so the Church says there's actually two purposes, two goals of the liturgy when we come here together. The first is the glory of God. It's primarily about worshiping Him. And second, it's about our sanctification. It's about coming here into his presence and allowing him to transform our hearts to become holy, to become more like him. So if the Mass has those two purposes, if it's about giving God glory and allowing him to transform us, then we can begin to see what the liturgy, what the Mass is not. The Mass is not about entertainment. You don't come here each week so that you can be entertained. Perhaps sometimes we get so caught up in all the other things that entertain us, and then it can feel like Mass is boring. Well, you don't come here to get entertained. It's also not about celebrating ourselves. I mean, all of our focus is up here to the Lord. It's about primarily the worship of God. It's not about making God conform to what we want, to our will, but instead letting Jesus transform our hearts and minds so that we can come to know and love the way that he does. So if somebody thinks or says, I don't really like how Mass is celebrated. Well, guess what? It's not about what we like. Mass has never been about what we like. It's about what God has asked us to do. You see, the Mass doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God. All of the sacraments, including the Eucharist, were instituted by Jesus and then entrusted to the Church to be protected and made available throughout the centuries. Pope Francis, in that document I mentioned earlier, he mentions this. He talks about it. That the liturgical celebration frees us from the prison of a self-referencing, nourished by one's own reasoning and one's own feeling. The action of the celebration does not belong to the individual, but to the Christ Church, to the totality of the faithful united in Christ. The liturgy doesn't say I, but we. So what he's saying there is the Mass doesn't belong to you, and it doesn't belong to me either as a priest. We can't just come here each week and decide for ourselves what we're going to do. It belongs to Jesus, who gave the authority to his church to protect it. And so practically that means we don't come and just make up the prayers and stuff that we're going to do as part of the Mass. All the prayers, all the gestures, everything that's part of the Mass has been given to us, determined through the Church, spelled out in her various documents and the ritual books. For example, the large red book that I pray from at Mass has very much of what we do as part of the liturgy there. Pope Francis says that every aspect of the liturgy must be carefully tended to. The space, the time, the gestures, the words, the objects, the vestments, the song, the music. Every rubric is to be observed. He says that such attention would be enough to prevent robbing from the assembly what is owed to it, namely the Paschal mystery celebrated according to the ritual that the Church sets down. So what he's saying there is that you, the faithful people of God, you have a right to have the Mass celebrated according to the norms of the universal Church. You have a right that when you come here to receive the Catholic Mass, because you come to the Mass to meet Jesus. You should not be subjected to a Mass celebrated according to the personal whims of any priest or any specific parish community or any specific individual within a parish community if their personal preferences aren't representative of the universal liturgy. The Church says in several different places that no one on personal authority, even if he's a priest, can add, remove, or change anything in the celebration of the Mass. And so that will kind of help you understand why I am very hesitant to add any kind of extra things into the liturgy that you don't find prescribed specifically in the Church's ritual books. There is a certain amount of flexibility for certain moments in the Mass, but by default, I really strive to do and to say and to sing precisely what the Church has given me to do. Because nothing in the Mass is arbitrary. Even our gospel reading today shows us where the two main parts of the Mass come from. In the gospel, Jesus meets the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And this account begins with his conversation with them that leads them to reflecting on many of the sacred scriptures, Moses and the prophets. And then Jesus explains them of how the Messiah needed to offer his life. And that's the first part of our Mass, is it not? The liturgy of the Word, in which we read the sacred scriptures, and they are expounded and explained to us through the homily. Then in this gospel, when they reach Emmaus, Jesus repeats what he did at the Last Supper. He took bread, he said the blessing, he broke it, and gave it to them. Well, that's the second half of the Mass, the liturgy of the Eucharist, in which Christ's body and blood is made present for our spiritual food. So the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, that goes all the way back to Jesus Christ. That's why we have it as the Mass today. And so much of what we do at this celebration has those kinds of ancient origins and deep theological meanings behind what we do. I'll try to bring forth more of that as we go through this series. So while I must hesitate to add things to the Mass that the Church doesn't prescribe specifically for us to do, I do expend great effort to include the options that she does recommend for the celebration of the Mass, specifically to lift up our celebration with greater solemnity and beauty. In our recent history within the Church, there has kind of been a trend, kind of a liturgical minimalism. What's the least amount that we have to do? And then we just do that. But that kind of attitude of just doing the bare minimum all the time isn't really a healthy one for us. Whether it's about the liturgy or other aspects of our life as a Christian. Liturgical minimalism doesn't reflect the intention of how the Church describes to celebrate the Mass. You see, we should give back to God our all, the most we can give, not just the least amount, what takes the least amount of time, the least amount of effort. Celebrating the liturgy is really an art, the Church says. It's related to the level of celebration that we celebrate on each specific day. Sundays and solemnities, like this evening, are our highest forms of celebration. And that's why we have more elements, like the Gloria that we sing at the beginning of Mass. We have a second reading. We have more music compared to the weekday Masses, where we only have one reading, no Gloria, much less music. For example, you hear me sing an awful lot on Sundays as part of our Mass. But if you come to our regular weekday Masses, you'll find I sing very little, because there's a difference in the level of the celebration, the solemnity. And truly, for example, on Easter, remember I sung quite a bit more to lift it up even higher, singing even the gospel, singing even the Eucharistic prayer, because there's no celebration greater than Easter Day, the Lord's resurrection. Sacred music, the Church says, raises the beauty of the liturgy. St. Augustine says that singing is for the one who loves. It represents an overflowing of our joy and gratitude to God. Some people, when they're not used to all that singing, will even seem to feel that, by the singing that I do, I'm basically adding my own arbitrary style onto the liturgy, which the Church says a priest shouldn't do. But that's not accurate, because all of the chants, all of the song that I sing in the liturgy, you find all that music in the book itself. It's all right there and prescribed for our use in the liturgy. And so I apply it in the way that the Church recommends in her books, through her own vision itself. Of course, there may be other Masses where there's priests who certainly don't sing as much as me, and that doesn't mean that they're being disobedient. Certainly each of us as priests have different levels of ability for singing, and not using song doesn't invalidate a Mass, just like we don't use very much on weekdays. But we don't want to get caught in the temptation to a liturgical minimalism, especially on our Sunday celebrations. Sundays, which should be the highest form of Mass and celebration that we have. It certainly would have been easier for me on Easter had I not sung all the parts that I did. I'm pretty exhausted by the time I'm done doing all the services for you. But I am convinced by what the church gives to us is that you as the faithful deserve to experience the Sunday Mass, and especially Easter, at its highest level possible. And so that's why I put so much energy into its celebration. The church says that sacred music forms a necessary, an integral part of the solemn liturgy. And so if Mass is going to truly be solemn, as it should be on Sundays and holy days, then music has to be a necessary part. We can't just ignore it. If sacred music, like the liturgy itself, isn't about doing what we like, it's about letting the words and the music of the Mass transform us to become more like Jesus. And so this is the beginning of our liturgical formation in the Mass. And I anticipate that this homily series will carry on through this Easter season, culminating, I think, with the celebration of Corpus Christi, the body and blood of our Lord. So in these coming homilies, we're going to walk through the Mass to learn how to pray during each of the different moments, to help us to grow in full, active, and conscious participation for the glory of God and our sanctification.